Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us for the first in a series of talks put on by the Faculty of Arts Research Institute for the Humanities. And the series is called Digital Humanities Across the Faculty. Tonight's speaker is Professor Grant Hamilton. I will introduce him a little bit more, and he will talk a little bit about how today's talk will run in just a second. I'll just say that I am David Hudder. I'm professor in the English department here, and Professor Hamilton is my colleague in the English department. But this series of talks is not just people from one department. It will also involve people from across the faculty, as the title suggests. And so we already have a second talk lined up for next month. The 13th of April, Professor Ivan Xu is going to talk about, as you see, re-understanding Chinese versification, digital humanities initiatives, and publicity and invites will go out for that relatively soon. And so we aim to have a series of speakers from different disciplines in different departments across the faculty, all of whom are taking a digital humanities approach of some kind, using innovative methods to ask new questions that perhaps couldn't be asked in the past of their various research areas. And so this should be a very interesting series of talks, and I hope you can join us in future for some of the later talks. Okay, today, Professor Hamilton, who is an expert in African literature, is going to talk about computational literary studies. Now, Professor Hamilton is, as I say, someone who's published very widely on African literature and edited collections and done a lot of interesting work. His most recent book, I believe, is called The London Object, which is not about African literature. But anyway, he's got many interests in different kinds of innovative research methods. But this one is the method that he's working on right now. And he's developing new approaches to a corpus of African fiction. And so I'm sure he will have a lot more to say about that later on. Perhaps he has a few things to say about how this talk will work as well, because we are slightly constrained, as you can imagine, by Zoom. But you could also view this as an opportunity to try something slightly different. And so this is not exactly your regular talk. So Professor Hamilton, if you would like to take over now.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for the introduction there, David. It's an honor, of course, to be invited to speak in what I think promises to be an extremely interesting series of talks on the digital humanities across the faculty, something that I think we've needed for a little while now. But anyway, going back to what David mentioned there, we are going to try and do something a little bit different in this talk. I was keen to future-proof this event against the virus. So what I've set about doing is recording the talk for you. So that's what you're going to be presented with here, a recording of this talk. That in itself offers some benefits. It means I can tell you it will be precisely 42 minutes long. But it also means that I can share with you images and moments of code without those kind of awkward interruptions that you might find if we were to try and do this live. The talk itself is, broadly speaking, structured into two sections. The first section amounts to a very general introduction to digital humanities and specifically the emergence of computational literary studies as both a discipline and as a way of working. The second half of the talk does something quite different. The second half of the talk is an introduction to a project that I'm currently working on. So it's not a completed project at all. That can be somewhat frustrating to listen to, I suppose, somebody presenting on an incomplete project. But I do so not as a presentation of an idea as such, but as a means of being able to stage some of the really exciting things that you can do with computational literary studies as a methodology, okay? So again, the stress here is not really on the topic that I'm presenting to you, but just on the ways of working. The one thing that I'm keen for everybody to take away from this talk is the idea that computational literary studies, sometimes also called quantitative literary studies, it's not something that's just reducible to the counting of a feature, okay? Oftentimes that's where we start, but the developments in mathematics and statistical modeling means that we can now do some really extraordinary things with those numbers. And I'm just keen to stage those for you, okay? Just to broaden our sense of what computational literary studies might mean and what the introduction to a digital humanities might actually encompass for somebody who's interested in turning towards that way of working. So I suppose I ought to stress at the very beginning that this is an introductory talk. It doesn't suppose any prior knowledge of anything that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. Having said that, I think even if you are somewhat familiar with some of the ideas that I'll be discussing, there may be something of interest for you a little bit towards the end of things when we ratchet up the complexity of methodology and so on. Now, given that we're presenting you with this pre-recorded presentation, it means we have a slightly different way of working for this event. Anyway, what that means is that I will be online in the chat room or the Q&A session, answering any questions you may have as they may occur to you as the video progresses, okay? I think we will have 5 or 10 minutes available to us at the end of the presentation for those questions that need a little bit more elaboration. But if you have some questions that occur to you as this talk is presented to you, please do jump into the chat room or the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. That's where I will be living for the next 42 minutes or so, and I will try and respond to you just as quickly as I can. Okay, so over to Professor Hudder. Thank you. If you can play that for us, we should kick off.
Although it's treated like a new approach to the humanities, it's clear that the digital humanities has been stalking English and history and other departments in humanities faculties for more than 70 years. As Suler and Hill write in their paper on the early history of the digital humanities, the orthodox history has it that the field emerged with Roberto Busa's work in 1946. The date, of course, marks the inception of Busa's Index Thomisticus, a lemmatized concordance project on the works of St. Thomas Aquinas that indexed nearly 11 million words, and if your Latin is up to scratch, you can interrogate the index here. But if one has the will to open up a definition of the digital humanities that goes beyond text analysis, then that point of genesis stretches further back than 1946. Nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that most literary scholars became interested in the digital humanities much later than this. In fact, it is an interest, I would say, that arrived with Franco Moretti's work in the field of world literature, which he began to publish at the turn of the millennium. Very briefly, Moretti argued that to do justice to the idea of world literature, rather than a national or regional literature, one ought to include as much of it as possible. Noting that 20th century literary criticism had largely been, he says, a theological exercise, which is to say an exercise which oversaw the very solemn treatment of very few texts taken very seriously, Moretti was concerned that orthodox literary histories ignored 95% or more of published work. Canonical work survived as the endlessly critiqued, while the rest succumbed to what he characterized in another provocative essay as the slaughterhouse of literature. What Moretti proposed as a corrective to this state of affairs was a new way of reading texts. Instead of close reading, what was required was a distant reading. Distant reading swapped the close analysis of texts for an analysis of trends and trajectories across texts. Over the following years, it quickly became apparent to Moretti and to others that such analysis was best conducted computationally. Indeed, only a computer could process the data encoded in the thousands of novels with which Moretti wished to work. To this end, the computer became an extremely valuable tool to the literary critic, one that has facilitated a quantitative analysis of text that has begun to reveal, in the words of Ted Underwood, longer arcs of change that have been hidden from us by their sheer scale. Today, such macro-scale trajectories found across literatures are now insisting that the literary scholar at least rethink the old narratives of literary history. It is a rethinking of literature, then, that depends on first establishing a corpus of texts upon which to work. Building such a corpus will be a familiar task to some in the faculty, but to the literary critic it is something of a foreign idea. Nonetheless, Moretti set about building his own corpus, a corpus that today boasts many tens of thousands of novels by American and European writers. However, today's literary scholar need not commit the same amount of time or resources to the enterprise of establishing a corpus, because there are impressive corpora online to which one can gain immediate access. Those corpora that spring immediately to mind are the Internet Archive, which claims to hold something like 34 million digitized texts, the Hathi Trust Digital Library, which claims a library over 17 million texts, and the free-to-access Project Gutenberg, which today has something like 60,000 texts that one can download. In the spirit of Moretti, though, I have set about building my own corpus, a first corpus of its kind, one dedicated to the 20th century Anglophone African novel, which is to say one of my key research areas over the last 15 years or so. But there are important considerations to address if this is the route one chooses to take, not least of which are the difficult legal questions to unwrap concerning copyright. Now, exploring copyright law is something that's worthy of a seminar unto itself, so perhaps it's best just to acknowledge the issue and then put that aside for discussion for another day. The one aspect of building such a corpus that is worth concentrating on is one that is routinely underestimated, and that is the sheer amount of work that is required to develop a corpus of any appreciable scale. If you are interested in doing so, you will need a team of people behind you. And the workflow for the digitization of a physical book will look something like this. First, there is the act of physically digitizing the text. This means scanning a book page by page. Then those scans need to be exported to a machine-readable format through some optical character recognition or OCR software. Given that no OCR software is perfect, each document then needs to be proofread to ensure accuracy of the digitized material. Here, working with African literature becomes especially challenging, for these are novels that are crammed with unfamiliar words to the English dictionary. Every word, however, must be checked against the original. Following this, the document is converted into the file type preferred by your statistical analysis environment. And even at this point, the workflow is not complete. The next stage is to open up a spreadsheet in order to record the metadata of the novels you have just brought into your corpus. The metadata you record is supremely important because those categories which constitute the metadata will be the common variables by which you analyze your corpus. Put simply, if you don't record the year of publication of a novel in your metadata, you cannot analyze your corpus in terms of publication year. Then there is the need to keep several backups of your corpus and metadata because at this stage the data that you have managed to accrue is the most valuable aspect of your project at large. Once you have developed such a corpus, the question then becomes, well, what do I do with it now? Obviously, you need some way of reading and manipulating the huge amount of data that you have collected in your corpus. This is when you make the choice between statistical analysis environments. Today, for the humanities scholar, that choice is largely between Python and a scripting language and statistical analysis environment known simply as R. I have chosen to work with R. Now, what is so good about R and Python, and really it doesn't much matter which one of these languages you choose to use, what's so good about them is that they are free open source environments. And what this means is that each environment boasts a remarkably large, passionate online community that is always seemingly willing to help those newer users who have run into a problem. Put simply, if you do not know how to code for an idea that you've had, you can simply pose a question to a discussion board, such as Stack Overflow, and a coding wizard or two will in short time produce something for you to use. Now, this highlights the degree to which you must become a coder if you begin using these environments. Indeed, the first question I often get asked when people are considering whether or not to use something like R is, do I need to know how to code? And the simple answer is no. But it will be helpful to understand the grammar of the code that you are using. This is how you will be able to manipulate the code you encounter on sites like Stack Overflow so that you can make it suit the demands of your own project. After 3 years or so of working on and off with R, I would put myself squarely in the class of intermediate user. That is, somebody who understands the various data structures at play, but at the same time cannot always write from scratch the right code to express an idea. And this is what we're talking about. This is a simple bit of R code that tells the computer to count all the appearances of the word barbarian in J.M. Coetzee's 1980 novel, Waiting for the Barbarians. Why would we need to know how many times the word barbarian appears in Coetzee's novel? Well, it may be an idle question, but it may also be an integral part of a grander hypothesis that is under examination. And this, in fact, leads on to what I think is the greatest of challenges leveled at the humanities scholar following a turn to the digital humanities, whether or not that's a turn to computational literary studies. Once you've loaded in your corpus and prepared yourself to run a little code, you are confronted with what kinds of question to ask of your data. Clearly, you cannot ask the type of questions that you have been trained to ask of data. You must ask something else, something that computation is able to deliver. For the literary critic, this means replacing questions about, say, the significance of a particular metaphor with questions about the statistical significance of terms. Going back to our off-the-cuff example, one could ask, is the word barbarian statistically significant in Coetzee's novel? In fact, that would be the wrong question to ask. Our question should be, what are the statistically significant words in Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians? Now, because of developments in mathematics and statistics, I can give you an answer to that question. Clearly, the most significant words in a novel are not simply the most frequent words. If that were true, then what we might think of as function words, words such as the, of, and a, and so on, well, they would always be the most significant words in a novel. And to put it simply, they are not. Instead, what we can do is run something called a TF-IDF algorithm, a term frequency inverse document frequency algorithm. And that accounts for the use of words across a document while discounting those ultra-high frequency function words. Here then is a list of the most statistically significant words in Coetzee's novel. Once this list is generated, we can then go on to ask why one particular term is more significant than another. And remember, this is a question of statistical significance. Whether the human brain likes it or not, there is something of statistical importance to be understood here. Of course, what the literary critic is hoping for at this moment is a word to appear that has been roundly ignored in the traditional scholarship on the novel. And that is indeed what we find here with the emergence of the word horse. While animality may have been discussed in the critical literature on Coetzee's writing, there is no paper that interrogates the specific significance of the figure of the horse in this particular novel. Well, that is until now, because I have a paper coming out later this year on precisely this topic. In this way, then, even simple computational analysis of text promises to open up unexplored avenues of inquiry. And actually, it was the result of this kind of simple quantitative analysis of a corpus of text that ultimately drew me into the field of computational literary studies. In his book Macroanalysis, Matthew Jockers, today a leading figure in the field, he made a curious observation that has always stayed with me. Comparing texts in a corpus of just over 3,000 American and British 19th century novels, Jockers found that the minor fluctuations in the use of the word "the" by American and British novelists over the century was almost perfectly parallel. Now, the calculations for making this observation are extremely simple. Just count the appearance of the word "the" as we did above for the word barbarian in Coetzee's novel. But Jockers' results were puzzling in the extreme. How was such a correlation possible? Remember, this was in the days before instant communication. The Atlantic Ocean posed a formidable barrier to the seemingly instant exchange of language habits that this graph seems to show. Nonetheless, here was a simple statistical analysis of a corpus of literature that raised genuinely new, and certainly unanticipated questions about the relationship between national literatures. And in case you were wondering, Jockers doesn't give an answer to this curious state of affairs, preferring instead to leave the question hanging, a question that only the quantitative analysis of texts could have produced, remember. And this is what I have since taken to be the true value of employing such statistical methods in the analysis of literature. Computational literary analysis has the potential to produce genuinely new avenues, perhaps genuinely new arenas of investigation for the literary critic. As such, computational literary analysis should not be thought of as a methodology that looks to somehow supplant traditional literary criticism. Rather, it's one that proves itself to be a valuable aid to the literary critic. I think it's true that computational analysis makes visible movements of literature that simply aren't visible to the individual scholar. To become aware of such movements is to enrich our understanding of literature proper. So it is in this spirit that I would like to introduce you to a project that I am currently working on, a project in process. I do so as a means to stage the kind of work that computational analysis makes possible. My hope is that you will go away from today's talk appreciating that such analysis is not reducible to simply counting the numbers of something, like the number of iterations of the word "the" in British and American literature of the 19th century, or the number of appearances of barbarian in Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians. Again, developments in statistical modeling and computational resources means that we are today able to do something truly remarkable. My current project on what I call the chromatic novel started as a thing of whimsy. I had read that years earlier, a young art student by the name of Jazz Parkinson had made paintings of her favourite books. How so? Well, she counted up all the colour words in her favourite novels and then painted the proportion of their occurrence like this. As a small project, I thought I could do something similar with my own favourite works of African literature. And so I did. But as I did this, I began to wonder who had written on the association of colour and literature. After a quick search, the earliest substantial essay I could find was one written by the controversial figure of Havelock Ellis in 1896, which had been republished in 1931 as a short monograph. He called his essay "The Colour Sense in Literature." Now, the interesting aspect of the essay, to me at least, was that Ellis not only counted colour words in a selection of literary works by hand, but that he also used those works to generate a very interesting hypothesis. His hypothesis was that colour can be used as both an instrument for investigating the conceptual landscape of a writer and as a means of objectively comparing such landscapes, not just the comparison of author to author, but national literatures to national literatures, and decades of writing to other decades of writing, and so on. It's John Casey who gives us something by way of a justification for Ellis's claim. As he puts it so economically, colour is not a feature of our world, but a feature of us. Put simply, we see and report in colour in our own way, a way that seems to reflect something about ourselves. This led to a very testable question. Could I unlock such a conceptual landscape through an examination of colour in the Anglophone African novel? And here, there's an aside to be made. I want to note the experimental nature of the project at hand. I had no idea what the data would say. I had a hypothesis, and I had the means by which to test that hypothesis. Now, for a literary critic, someone, that is, who usually does not sit down to write a paper until most of the argument is well in place, this is a confronting but also intoxicating new way of working. Anyway, Ellis concludes his essay with these testable words. There are three things, it seems to me, which colour in literature describes or symbolises: nature, man, imagination. These three cover the whole ground. The predominance of green or blue, the colours of vegetation, the sky and the sea. That means that the poet is predominantly a poet of nature. If red and its synonyms are supreme, we may assume an absorbing interest in man and woman, for there are the colours of blood and love, the two main pivots of human affairs, at all events in poetry. And where there is predominance of black, white, and I think I would add yellow, the colours that are rare in the world, and the colour of golden impossibilities, well, there we shall find that the poet is singing with, as it were, closed eyes, intent on his own inner vision. So here I load in my corpus of 217 Anglophone African novels of the 20th century. Against these texts I run a small piece of code that searches each novel for the occurrence of colour words. And here you can see which words I've told the computer to search for. Currently, it stands as a list of 56 colour terms. Those terms include colours such as aquamarine, dun, and chartreuse. I then tell the computer to assign these colour words to one of the 11 basic colour groups that is described in Berlin and Kay's influential work on colour and culture. These are the colour groups we're all familiar with, that is, black, white, red, green, yellow, blue, brown, purple, pink, orange, and finally grey. And here are the results. Now what you see here is a report on the colours that we searched for in our corpus. The numbers that you see are not to be mistaken for raw count figures, rather they're percentages. Why? Well, this mitigates the difference one would inevitably find between longer and shorter text. Obviously, the longer a text, the more colour terms you would expect it to employ. So, for example, in Andre Brink's chain of voices, you see that of all the colour words found in the novel, 8.28% of them fall under the red colour group. The one figure that perhaps won't immediately make sense is that of relative density, which you can see here in column C. The relative density score represents the percentage of a text that are colour words, but importantly, after function words have been removed. So again, looking at Brink's novel, we see that 1.5 words in every 1,000 is a colour word. This gives us a sense of the colour richness of a text, or put another way, how important colour seems to be to the text at large. This is information that can be represented graphically, and here what you see is J.M. Coetzee's 20th century novels represented in terms of their colour use. However, we need do nothing more complicated than sort the previous spreadsheet to find which text should resonate with Havelock Ellis's findings. Those texts which favour the colours of green or blue, the colours of vegetation, the sky and the sea, as Ellis would have it, well, those texts are W.P.B. Botha's Wantok, Bonnie Lubega's The Outcasts, Chinua Achebe's No Longer at Ease, Doris Lessing's The Marriages Between Zones 3, 4 and 5, and Rebecca Njau's Ripples in the Pool. Now Botha's Wantok is set in a remote part of Polynesia, which I would say is a tick in favour of Ellis's findings. And so too is Bonnie Lubega's The Outcast, which is set deep in the African interior. Achebe's novel is more complicated, the main protagonist moving between rural life at the beginning of the novel to Britain and eventually to Lagos at its conclusion. However, Doris Lessing's novel seems to resist fully Ellis's classification. The Marriage is a science fiction novel, a feminist science fiction novel that explores at length gender hierarchies in society and various forms of mysticism. Rebecca and Giles Ripples in the Pool, interestingly enough, is also concerned with gender issues, but it is set in urban Kenya rather than somewhere in the interior. Is there some kind of coherence in the thematic concerns of these novels that would lead one to a revisionary categorization of the literature at hand then? Well, no. What of Red, Ellis's Colour of Blood and Love, the two main pivots of human affairs? Well, here we'll find Amos Tutuola's The Palm Wine Drinkard, Nzekwu's Blade Among the Boys, Wangusa's Upon This Mountain, Festus Siyayi's The Contract, and Ama Ata Aidu's Changes. And perhaps the first interesting thing to note from these results is that if the prose leans towards the red colour spectrum, the chances are that it is not very much interested in colour. Why do I say this? Well, the average use of colour words across the corpus is 0.231, that is, just over 2 colour words for every 1,000 words. None of the texts noted here reach that threshold. And is this a literature of human affairs? Well, Tutuola's novel describes a man's search for his dead palm wine tapster. His journeys through hallucinatory landscapes are drawn from Yoruba folk tales. And Nzekwu's novel, Blade Among the Boys, is premised on the conflict between the new social realities taking shape after colonialism and the demands of traditional or pre-colonial culture. Similarly, Wangusa's novel describes the challenges of growing up between traditional and colonial cultures. On the other hand, Festus Siyayi's novel reflects his own Marxist sensibilities in that it focuses on the chaos and corruption of the business class in his native Nigeria. Ama Ata Aidu's Changes, though, is, I suppose, exactly the kind of writing that Ellis had in mind when he imagined the landscape of this category. This is a novel that recounts the trials and tribulations of the life and loves of Essie Seki, a young, educated career woman in contemporary Ghana. So back to our question, is there some kind of coherence in the thematic concerns of these novels that would lead one to a revisionary categorization of the literature at hand? No. What about those novels that tend towards a monochromatic colour palette, those that prefer black, white, or sometimes yellow? Well, an investigation of our corpus leads us to these 5 novels. Ngugi wa Thiong'o's The River Between, Chinua Achebe's Arrow of God, Chenjerai Hove's Bones, Gabriella Kara's The Voice, and Kojo Lane's Major Gentle and the Achimota Wars. Again, one can ask whether there is a shared thematic concern to these novels. And again, the answer returned is no. The novels shown here range from those which engage with the struggle of negotiating traditional and imported values, to those that assume an anti-colonial mien of cultural resistance, to surrealistic works that play with the possibilities of language at every turn. These simply aren't works where the author is, in the words of Ellis, singing with closed eyes, intent on his own inner vision. And on reflection, it may have been somewhat naive to think that colour use in literature had not changed across the decades and geographies that I was examining. Yet, there was something to Ellis's project that captured the imagination. Could one interrogate the chromatic landscape of the novel in such a way that it made visible a new way of classifying texts? And with it, a new way of thinking the literary history of the Anglophone African novel. In short, could the use of colour in a text be correlated with another feature of the text, perhaps a thematic feature or perhaps something more mundane, that could in turn describe a whole class of novel? Was it possible, for example, to say that those novels which favoured the use of the colour orange spoke mostly about fire and perhaps therefore destruction, while those that favoured, say, purple spoke mostly about other things? In order to begin this project, I felt the need to revisit the terms of critique. My first engagement with colour words in literature had made it quite clear that colour worked in a much more nuanced way in prose than Ellis had supposed. Put simply, the chromatic landscape of a novel was not only determined by the colour words given in the prose, but also by objects and sometimes actions carried out within the prose itself. The point is made clear if I talk about the snow that is falling outside of my window. Snow has a colour association that one simply cannot ignore, and that word colour association is therefore something that one must take into consideration when thinking about the chroma of a literary text. Now, the thought of running through the dictionary assigning a colour to words like snow, night, or danger, well, that's probably one that will fill most with dread, and rightly so. But by leveraging the power of crowdsourcing, Saif Mohammed achieved exactly this goal back in 2011. I'll spare you the details of the methodology, but suffice it to say that Mohammed crowdsourced a lexicon of word colour associations that runs to nearly 9,000 entries. Snow, night, and danger are just 3 of those 9,000 words. Running this lexicon in addition to the more prosaic colour word search that I had already carried out, I reanalyzed my corpus with very interesting results. Outside of a few exceptions, each text began to return an almost identical signal. As the same signal began to emerge time and time again, I began to wonder whether my results actually said something about the English language rather than the conceptual landscape of specific writers. To test this idea, I ran the same analysis on a 160,000 word corpus of American newspapers, and that corpus was hosted at the Oxford Text Archive. Why? Well, because that is a corpus of writing that was substantially different in almost every way to the corpus that I was interrogating. And interestingly, I saw the same signal return. My conclusion was that my analysis was revealing a condition of the English language. It affirmed that Heideggerian sense of things, which is to say that language speaks us and not vice versa. This was the colour signal of the English language. Still, the analysis showed that there were those texts that preferred blue over other colours and texts that preferred red and so on. In the search for a correlation, my next impulse was to test whether the colour preference of a text was linked with the sentiment of a novel as a whole. Was red really the colour of anger? In order to test this, I conducted a sentiment analysis on the corpus. Put simply, a sentiment analysis reports on the number of words that are associated with a particular emotion. One of the most widely used lexicons for this kind of analysis in the humanities is the NRC Word Emotion Association lexicon. It returns the general valence of sentiment in a text at hand, which is to say how positive or negative the sentiment of the text is, and how that language of sentiment is distributed among 8 emotional states. The states of anger, anticipation, disgust, fear, joy, sadness, surprise, and trust. Again, just as a quick demonstration, here is this information rendered graphically when interrogating J.M. Coetzee's 20th century novels. Rather than working with these numbers on an individual basis, we can run them through something called a correlation matrix. This matrix will determine the correlation coefficients between terms, meaning in this case that if there is a pattern to be discerned between color and any of the 8 emotions that we are testing for, it will find that relationship. Unfortunately, my preliminary results seem to indicate that there is no strong correlation between the chromatic landscape of a novel and its emotional state. This has led me to search for other possible sites of correlation. One way that I am interested in exploring further concerns the idea of word embedding. In brief, word embedding uses clever mathematics and neural networks to represent the context, relationships, and similarities between words in a text. The idea here is that words can be mapped in a high-dimensional vector space in such a way that they ultimately reveal an alliance of other words that one might reasonably think of as giving the meaning of the word at hand. Here, the meaning of a word comes to us through the way it is employed in a set of texts, rather than through reference to an external source like a dictionary. Here is an example of the meaning of grey, for example. Grey being Coetzee's preferred colour. The question, of course, is whether the other texts that favour a grey chroma share such word embeddings. This is a question that I still need to answer. The section of this project that I am most engaged with presently, though, explicitly returns one to the idea that the chromatic landscape of a novel can be an important means of classifying it. My work in this area revolves around the idea that the chain of numbers that describe the colours used in a particular novel can serve as high-dimensional vectors. We're used to the idea that 2 numbers can represent coordinates on a graph with x and y axes. We might even be comfortable with a 3-dimensional graph, one that develops a z-axis. Well, we can use this long chain of numbers that represent the chromatic landscape of a novel as a means of plotting a position on a graph with, as it happens, 51 dimensions. After running a kernel principal component analysis that, through extremely impressive mathematics, has the effect of reducing these 51 dimensions to 3, while maintaining much of the character of those 51 dimensions, we can then find the cosine similarity between plots in order to cluster the results. This is what you see here. In fact, you are amongst the first people in the world to see this. This is the Anglophone African novel clustered solely in terms of the chromatic landscape of those novels under investigation. Again, the next step is to construct a correlation matrix to see if there are any statistically significant features that are unique to each cluster of the novels. So far, no correlations. But my analysis has only just started. There is a good deal of work left to do. So let me offer some words by way of brief conclusion. First is that a computational approach to literary studies and digital humanities at large, well, that should not be regarded as a threat to the more traditional approaches to the humanities. Rather, the digital humanities offers a fascinating new avenue of engagement, one that can only enrich our areas of study. Second, it's clear that those scholars who adopt this way of working will have to learn to ask very different kinds of questions about their objects of study if they are to be properly rewarded by the products of computational methodologies. To my mind, this is the most confrontational aspect of choosing a turn to the digital humanities. We must all be willing to become again a student of our discipline. Lastly, for the literary critic, computational literary studies amounts to an invitation to read literature again. All of it. And in this grand rereading of our shared literary heritage, new intellectual communities and new paradigms of thinking will surely be born. This, I think, is the most utopian aspect of computational literary studies. I hope I have shown you that there is much virgin ground to be worked in the digital humanities, and that the potential of this methodology is still largely unknown. But with a genuinely cross-disciplinary team in place, one that is drawn from the humanities and departments of mathematics and computer science and so on, well, I think remarkable advancements in our subject areas are waiting to be made.
Okay, thanks very much, Grant, for that fascinating talk. I'm sure that people have questions, many questions about your approach, also perhaps about the specific research project. So at this time, we have a short period for questions, if anybody.
We do. Nina from our MA program submitted a wonderful question, as we would expect of Nina, asking about the cultural specificity of color and how that might modify this project. And I think it's a wonderful question to ask, Nina. You're absolutely right. Not only do colors mean different things in different cultures, but different colors exist in different cultures. This is what all the anthropological work shows us and tells us. So it's something that we have to bear in mind if we're going to be pursuing this kind of work at length. One thing that I should state that stands in favor of what you've just witnessed is that the methodology that Saif Mohammed employed when he was building this lexicon of word color associations, which is the lexicon I rely more heavily on in this work, is something that takes into account this fact. And that is probably as much as I should say about it here, but it's a great question, Nina. Yeah, very something to be very conscious of.
Okay, anyone else? Any attendees like to raise a hand? Brief questions?
I think we're all heading towards dinner time, so.
It is. It's the end of the day. Maybe I can ask a quick question
Sure.
about the size of the corpus. Did you say 217?
It's 217 Anglophone African novels, specifically.
So apologies to everyone. We're getting messages from the Hong Kong government about an emergency alert. That sounds very alarming, but it's nothing actually. I don't think it's an emergency at all. So
it's
apologies
somewhat
for that.
dramatic, but there you go. It's just about the Queen Elizabeth Hospital being redesignated for COVID purposes. So yes, 217 English language African novels in this particular corpus. The African Literary Archive, from which I've drawn that particular subset, is creeping up towards the 400 text mark.
Okay.
So there is interesting work to be conducted on literatures in translation and so on. So yeah, the corpus, the broader corpus is larger, but these results are premised on just 217 novels.
Sure. We haven't got very long, and there are some more questions coming in, but I had in mind, you mentioned Moretti, and some of his initial kind of inspiration to start doing this is the fact that so much is lost almost. It's about obscurity. Canonicity is the escape from obscurity. And I wondered, I know you've worked on the London novel and London fiction, and I know they have an Emotions of London project, which is like 5,000 novels. So there are certain kinds of limits to what you might be able to do. But how much African Anglophone fiction is in obscurity, would you say, and is still to be brought into your corpus?
Yeah, the answer to that is much. One of the reasons that we're focusing on the 20th century African novel is that really African writing starts in earnest around the 1940s, 1950s, in English, we're talking about here, and then accelerates as the century gets towards its conclusion. In a sense, there's an idea that you could approach a complete archive of African prose fiction from the 20th century. But like I say, as we get towards the end of the 20th century and towards the beginning of the 21st, it becomes an enormous amount of work. So yes, 217 is not an especially large corpus, but it's a start. One of the things that we're also grappling with is just the sheer amount of man hours, woman hours, that goes into this digitizing project. It's something that it's easy to forget about, but you are limited by the sheer amount of hours that you can put into a work like this. And yeah, we have folks running around the African continent for us, scouring secondhand bookshops, trying to get that literature to us that is not available on all of those sources that we usually frequent, the Amazons and the eBays. There's a whole bunch of stuff out there that just needs to be sent to us physically from the African continent.
Sure, thanks. There are a few more questions in the chat. Maybe I can just pick out a couple.
Sure.
Emily Chow asks, and I know this is an interesting question because I'm aware that University of Hong Kong is developing a BA in digital humanities. Do you think this kind of methodology can be used and taught at the undergraduate level in the near future? And so what kind of training do you need to be able to ask the right kinds of questions?
Yeah, well, I very much hope so, because if we keep our fingers crossed, I will be delivering such a course next year to our undergraduates. I think, Emily, it's a great question, and we have to sort of temper our expectations of what a course like that can deliver. First, we have to, I think, enthuse the student body, and we do that by giving them a corpus to play with, explaining how they can manipulate the text within a corpus, and ultimately produce what I think are these fascinating visualizations of this data. And we're just embedding it in a more traditional way of approaching literature, and saying to our students, there are other ways of doing literary criticism than just close reading, I think. And I suppose until we get a minor in digital humanities or a program, if we can think that boldly, in digital humanities, we're going to have to be happy with just embedding some of these ideas into the programs that are already running.
Okay, great. Time is running out a little bit. I'll just leave you with one further question. Do you think such research projects and their extended products can eventually teach AI to write decent novels for humans.
I hope so. I hope so. I have played around with artificial intelligence and fiction writing. It's a fascinating area. It's right at the beginning of things. If people are interested, they can type into Google this thing called Markov chains, and this is the sort of basic introductory level of asking a computer to really become creative in and of itself, which seems like a remarkable thing to demand of a processor that works in ones and zeros. But a couple of months ago, I left my office computer on for 3 days. Should I admit this? I should, with a note which said, please don't turn my computer off if you come in and it's nighttime and you see my computer on. And what I was doing there was I had fed the computer 8 novels of Coetzee, and I ran through a particular artificial intelligence program which asked it to learn how to write, given this corpus of 8 novels of Coetzee's that I had trained it on. And after 3 days, it was generating half a sentence that sounded very much like Coetzee. And it's worth stressing, it wasn't copying and pasting passages from Coetzee novel, from novel to novel and then onto this new platform. It was literally teaching itself how to form English sentences, but only using Coetzee's novels as its reference for doing so. Like I say, this stuff is right at the beginning of development, and it's a brilliant time to get in on this. So if artificial intelligence is something that you're interested in, there's an incredible world to explore, I think.
Okay, I think we're out of time. There was at least one other question from Stuart Christie from Baptist University, which is fairly complex, and maybe we can take up in other forums at a later date. Thanks, Stuart. Sorry about that. I'm sure you'll all wish to thank Professor Hamilton for his fascinating talk and his answers to questions. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's talk. And I hope that the Research Institute will see you again for future talks along the same kind of lines, okay? So thanks very much. And everybody, particularly everybody in Hong Kong, of course, stay safe. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.